Hello there everyone, my name is David Lutchford and welcome to lesson 13 of my Ancient Greek course. And lesson 13 is on the dative case, and as you can see it's going to be an introductory lesson. And it's an introductory lesson in that in this video I'm just going to be covering the main use or the basic meaning of the dative case. Now this is particularly significant because this is the fourth and final of the main cases in Ancient Greek. You've already met the nominative case, the accusative case, and the genitive case, and now you're meeting the dative case. And by the way, that's the order that we list them in when we are declining a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective, in the UK at least. We list the cases in the order nominative, accusative, genitive, dative. It spells nagged. However, I know that elsewhere in Europe they're listed in a different order. But anyway, this is the fourth one in the UK list. There is a fifth case in Ancient Greek called the vocative case, but that isn't very important for us right now, and we shall cover that later on. Okay, without further delay, let's get on to the dative case. And let me start by saying that when I taught you about the genitive case, I told you to remember one word, and with the genitive case, that word was of. Now, with the dative case, I'm asking you to remember two words in order to remember its basic meaning. And those two words are to and for. That is to say, if you meet a noun in the dative case and the basic use of the dative case is being employed, then you should translate that noun by putting either to before it or for before it. So a noun in the dative, assuming the basic use is being employed, which it will be throughout this video, should be translated either as to that noun or for that noun. Now the dative can be used to mean to or for in a lot of different senses. To and for capture a lot of different kinds of the dative, in the same way that the word of captures a lot of different kinds of genitive. And we'll look at those particular kinds of dative in the future, but for now it's most important to remember that the dative should be translated using to or for. And which of these you would use would depend upon the context. So when you translate a dative noun, consider which of these sounds best. To that noun or for that noun. Now I've said that the dative can be used to mean to and for in a lot of different particular ways. But one very important sense in which it means either to or for is in the sense that the dative can be used to indicate what is called the indirect object. And when the dative is being used to indicate what's called the indirect object, it should be translated either as to that thing or for that thing. But let's take a look at what we mean by the term indirect object. Okay, so the indirect object is the person or the people to whom something is given, said, etc., or for whom something is done. So to illustrate, if you said, I gave the book to the teacher would be the indirect object, and in Greek, the teacher would simply go in the dative case. There wouldn't be a separate word for to. You would just put the teacher in the dative, because the dative can be used to indicate the indirect object. Likewise, if you said, I am speaking to the teacher, there the teacher would also be the indirect object, since the indirect object is the person or the people to whom something is given or said, etc. And in that example, I am speaking to the teacher, you would once again just put the teacher in the dative case in Greek. Greek would simply put the teacher in the dative case, most of the time at least. So I've given you two examples of the indirect object being the person to whom something is given or said. Now you might wonder, what do I mean by etc.? There are some other verbs where we would also say to someone in the same sense. This includes verbs like the verb to offer. If you offer something, then you offer it to someone. Similarly, the verb to show would also take an indirect object because you show something to someone. So that's what I mean by etc. there. Now let's consider an example where the indirect object is the person for whom something is done. Here we can think of the sentence, the slave is carrying the wine for the master. There, the master is the person for whom something is being done. That is to say, something is being done on his behalf. And so the master is therefore the indirect object, and in Greek, you would simply put the master in the dative case. You wouldn't have a separate word meaning for. You would just put the master in the dative, and in that context it would mean for the master. So the dative case can be used to indicate the indirect object, as defined here. And that is one way in which the dative can mean either to or for. However, the dative can mean either to or for in senses other than the one defined here. That is to say, the dative can mean to or for without indicating the indirect object. It can mean to and for in other ways. So for example, if you said in Greek, it seems good to me to do this, then there, to me would be expressed by the dative form of me. So once again, in that example, the dative would mean to, but there, it isn't being used to indicate the indirect object. The word me there isn't the indirect object because that is not the person to whom something is given, said, etc. In that example, the word me is not being used to indicate the recipient, as the indirect object is sometimes described as being. And likewise, the dative can mean for in senses other than the indirect object one. So for example, you might say, this defeat was catastrophic for the Spartans. And there, for the Spartans, would simply be expressed by putting the Spartans in the dative case. But in that example, the Spartans aren't the indirect object. There's nothing being done for them or for their benefit. In fact, in that example, something is happening to their disadvantage. But the dative would still be used in that example. So just be aware that the dative can mean to or for in other senses than this one. But the indirect object is one key way in which it can mean to or for, and so I'm going to speak a little bit more about it. In particular, you might be wondering, haven't I heard that the accusative is used to indicate the object? And yes, you may have heard that. But when people say that, what they mean is that the accusative case is used to indicate the direct object, whereas the dative case can be used to indicate the indirect object. And the difference is, the direct object is having the action of the verb done to it directly. So in the sentence, I am carrying the book is the direct object because it is the thing being carried. But if we expanded that sentence to say, I am carrying the book for the teacher, there, the book would still be the direct object because it's the thing being carried. It's directly on the receiving end of the action of the verb. But the teacher would be the indirect object because the action is being done for him. It's being done on his behalf. So he's kind of a step further removed than the direct object. The direct object is the thing that the action of the verb is being most immediately and most directly channeled towards. Whereas the indirect object is the person or the people to whom something is given, said, etc., or for whom something is being done. So that's the difference. But let's quickly look at an English example on the board to clearly illustrate this difference between the direct object, indicated by the accusative case in Greek, and the indirect object, which the dative case can indicate in Greek. Okay, here we have the English sentence, the boy gives a gift to the girl. Here, the boy is the one doing the giving, so we know that he is the subject, because remember the subject, in grammatical terms, is the one that's doing the action of the verb. And in Greek, we indicate the subject using the nominative case, and therefore in Greek, the boy would be in the nominative case. And then gives is a doing word, so therefore we know that it's the verb in the sentence. So I've put that gives is the verb. And then we've got a gift to the girl. Now the gift is the thing that's actually having the action of the verb directly done to it. It is the thing that's being given, and therefore the gift is the direct object because it's immediately on the receiving end of the action of the verb. The action of the verb is being directly done to it. It's the thing being given, and therefore, as I just said, the gift is the direct object, and in Greek that would be indicated by the accusative case. So the gift would be in the accusative case because the gift is the direct object. And then finally, we have this phrase, to the girl. Because the girl is the person to whom something is being given, she is the indirect object, as I have put on the board there. And in Greek, the girl would therefore go in the dative case, because one of the uses of the dative case is indicating the indirect object. Now there's one other thing to note about the indirect object, and this will be useful when you're translating Greek. And that is, if the indirect object is being used to refer to the person to whom something is being given, said, etc., that is the first part of the indirect object definition, then in that case, in English, we can actually mention the indirect object in a sentence without using the word to. And we can do that by putting the indirect object before the direct object. See if you can imagine how to do that with this sentence. If you put the indirect object, the girl, before the direct object, the gift, how would that look? You might have realised that it would look like this. The boy gives the girl a gift. In this example, the girl is still the indirect object because she's still the person to whom something is being given. However, in English, if we put the indirect object before the direct object, then we omit the word to. So for clarity, I've labelled that the girl is still the indirect object and the gift is still the direct object, even though in this English example, we don't have the word to preceding the girl. But she's still the person to whom it's being given. We just leave out the word to when we put the indirect object first. Now I'm telling you this because some of you that are studying Greek independently and want to make your translations more stylish, more natural perhaps, might find this fact useful because sometimes it might sound a bit clunky in English to either say to someone or to keep saying to someone. It might sound unnatural. And so if you're translating Greek just for fun and you want to translate it stylishly, then bear in mind you could express the indirect object without using the word to in this way. And now you can't do the same if the indirect object is the person for whom something is being done. You can't leave out the word for in the same way. But you can do it with the word to by moving the indirect object before the direct object. However, if you're somebody that's taking Classical Greek GCSE or Classical Greek A-level, then I would encourage you to not do this and to stick with translations that use the word to when the dative is indicating the indirect object because it's indicating the person to whom something's being given or said, etc. And the reason I would encourage you to do that if you're doing the GCSE or the A-level is because it minimises the potential for error or for things to go wrong, and it keeps things a lot clearer, I think, than doing it this way. And so if you're doing Greek in school, I would encourage you to put the indirect object after the direct object in your translations because it's a lot clearer. But we're now going to look at some Greek examples, and all I want you to do is bear in mind that nouns in the dative should be translated either using to or for, and see which sounds best given the context of each of the examples. But before we look at the examples, there are two things that I need to say to you. The first of which is we are once again going to be using the definite article as a key, so please make sure you know the forms of the definite article. As a reminder, the dative forms of the definite article are as follows. The masculine dative singular form of the definite article is toi, the feminine dative singular form of the definite article is te, and the neuter dative singular form of the definite article is toi. So the masculine dative singular and neuter dative singular forms of the definite article are visually identical. But you'll know which gender toy is because you will know the gender of the noun that it's going with. That is to say, applying to. And then if we look at the dative plural forms of the definite article, the masculine dative plural form is tois, the feminine dative plural form is tais, and the neuter dative plural form is tois. So once again, the masculine and neuter dative plural forms are visually identical. So, if you see one of those dative forms of the definite article being used, then you know that the noun that definite article is applying to must be in the dative. And you also know whether it's singular or plural. And in addition, you know its gender, because the definite article needs to completely agree with the noun that it applies to in gender, case, and number. But where the gender is ambiguous, as with the identical forms, you need to know the gender of that particular noun separately. But the important thing for now is that you know the case and the number of the noun from the definite article. And the second thing that I have to say to you before we look at these examples is that I must remind you of the meaning of one verb and introduce you to a new verb, because these two verbs are pretty essential to the dative case. And the first of them is legor. And legor means speak, say, or tell. And we know that this particular form, legor, means I speak, I say, or I tell. Now I have shown you legor before, however I think previously I just told you that it means speak or say, but it can also mean tell. However, throughout this lesson it's just going to mean speak, okay? So when you see legor in this lesson, it will just mean speak, but please remember it can have these three meanings: speak, say, or tell. And the second verb is the one that I need to introduce you to. And I initially deliberated whether to introduce this verb at this point because it is a me verb. You'll remember that in lesson 8 of my ancient Greek course, I said that there are three categories of verb in ancient Greek. Firstly, you have verbs in or, that is to say, verbs that end in omega in the present indicative active first person singular. Secondly, you have verbs in me, that is to say, verbs that end in mu iota in the present indicative active first person singular. And then thirdly, you have irregular verbs. Now, Greek courses typically introduce me verbs at quite a late stage, and indeed I shall cover them in depth at a later time as well. However, the verb to give in ancient Greek is a me verb, and the verb to give is just essential to the dative case. In fact, the term dative comes from a part of the Latin verb do, which is the verb to give. Because if you give something, you give it to someone. And so that's how bound up the dative case is with the verb to give. And so I saw no option other than to introduce you to the verb didωμι. And as I've already given away, didωμι means give. And this is the present indicative active first person singular. And so we know that this form itself, didωμι, means I give or I am giving. And like I said, I will cover me verbs in a much greater depth at a later stage. But for the purposes of this lesson, I shall give you the conjugation of didωμι in the present indicative active. So I give, you give, etc. And I'd like you to note it down so that you have it for reference when we're looking at the examples and when you're doing the exercise a bit later on. Okay, to begin the present indicative active conjugation of didωμι, we have the first person singular form, didωμι, meaning I give or I am giving. And then in the second person singular, we have didos, which means you singular give or you singular are giving. And then in the third person singular, we have didorsin, which means he, she, or it gives or he, she, or it is giving. And note that this could be seen as didorsi. It has a movable nu at the end. And I've told you before that movable nu is added if the next word begins in a vowel. But I neglected to mention before that movable nu is also added if the verb appears at the end of the sentence, that is, as the last word in the sentence. In most cases, at least. There are some instances where editors dispute whether movable nu should be there at the end of a sentence, but typically movable nu is included if the verb that can have movable nu is at the end of the sentence. So if the third person singular form of διδωμι appeared at the end of a sentence, if it were the last word in the sentence, it would be διδωσιν rather than just διδωσι. And the first person plural form of διδωμι is διδωμεν, which means we give or we are giving. The second person plural form is διδωτε, meaning you plural give or you plural are giving. And then finally, the third person plural form is διδωασιν, which means they give or they are giving. And note that the third person plural form also has a movable nu. So please note down this conjugation so that you have it for reference when we're looking at the examples and when you're doing the exercise. I'll just say a few things about this now because, like I said, I'll go into me verbs in much greater depth later on. So one thing to note is that there are some similarities with the endings you've learned for verbs in or in the present indicative active. For example, the second person singular of verbs in or in the present indicative active is ace. Here it's ors, so both second person singular forms end in sigma. The next thing to note is that both first person plural forms end in men. In fact, in the case of διδωμι in particular, they both end in omen. However, not all me verbs will have omen, but they will all have men in the present indicative active first person plural. Another similarity is that you've got the ending te in the second person plural. In verbs in or, it is ete. In the case of διδωμι in particular, it is ote. And then finally, one other similarity is that you've got the ending sin in the third person plural. In verbs in or, you have the ending usin. In the case of διδωμι, you've got arsin. And if you learn this conjugation, it will be useful when we come to learn about me verbs more broadly. But note that you can't yet conjugate all me verbs in the present indicative active just by learning how διδωμι conjugates. But you can learn how all verbs in or conjugate in that tense mood and voice just by learning how one of them conjugates. You can't do the same thing just by learning διδωμι because the vowel that comes before the endings, so in διδωμι's case you've got omega in the first three forms and then omicron in the last three, changes depending on which me verb you're dealing with. But we'll cover that at a later time. For now, just note down these forms. So, with that said, let's look at some examples of the dative case in ancient Greek. Okay, here is our first example. And it says, Chodoulos lege toi despotei. So, to begin with, we know that the slave is the subject because ho is the masculine nominative singular definite article. This phrase being in the nominative is what lets us know that the slave is the subject. He's the one doing the action. Then we've got lege. That's the third person singular, present indicative active of legor. So we know lege means he, she, it speaks. And we've got a subject, so we know who exactly is doing the speaking, namely the slave. So this is the slave speaks or is speaking toi despotei. Toi is the masculine dative singular definite article. We know it's masculine because despotes, here despotei, is a masculine noun. And because this phrase is in the dative, as indicated by the dative definite article, we know that we need to translate this either as to the master or for the master. So given the context, the slave speaks, what makes more sense? To the master or for the master? You could speak for somebody on somebody's behalf, but I think the meaning to the master is more probable here. And therefore, we will translate this sentence as the slave is speaking to the master. So there, that dative phrase is actually indicating the indirect object, because the master is the person to whom something is being said. Okay, let's look at a second example now. And our second example is the sentence "Ho doulos didosi ten epistolen tei korei." Once again, we know the slave's the subject from the definite article, so he must be doing the action. And then we've got didosi. We know that's the third person singular of διδωμι in the present indicative active. So didosi means he, she, or it gives or is giving, but we have the subject, ho doulos, so we know who exactly is doing the giving, namely the slave. So this means the slave gives, and then we've got ten epistolen. Because ten is feminine accusative singular, we know epistolen must also be feminine accusative singular. And since this phrase is accusative, we know that the letter must be the direct object. It is the thing that is being given. And so we know this means the slave gives the letter, and then we've got te, korei. Te is the feminine dative singular form of the definite article, and therefore we know that korei must also be feminine dative singular. And since this whole phrase, the girl, is dative, we either need to translate it as to the girl or for the girl. So what makes more sense? The slave gives the letter to the girl, or the slave gives the letter for the girl? Although once again you could give something on somebody's behalf, I would say it's much more probably to the girl, since when you give something, you give it to someone. And so we would translate this sentence as the slave gives the letter to the girl. Once again, the dative here was being used to indicate the indirect object, since the girl is the person to whom something is being given. But like I said, please bear in mind that the dative can be used to mean either to or for in senses other than that of the indirect object. Before showing you the next example, I need to introduce you to a new noun. Exciting times, I know. And that noun is doron. Doron means gift or present. So a doron is a gift or a present. And I put to next to it to signify that doron is a neuter noun. To is the form of the definite article that would be used with it in the nominative singular. To is neuter nominative singular, and that lets us know that doron is a neuter noun. And you might have spotted that it has this do part in common with the word διδωμι, and both of them are about giving. And that is not a coincidence. They are etymologically related. The do part refers to giving, and a doron is a thing that is given, which we would call a gift or a present. So watch out for this new noun in the next example. Okay, the third example we have uses a slightly different word order to the English word order. So we do need to spot which case each noun is in and then put the sentence together accordingly. Now let's look at the sentence. We have to doron toi despotei didosin ho doulos. So to start with to doron, to could be either nominative or accusative. We're not sure until we've looked at the rest of the sentence, because to is used in the neuter nominative singular form and the neuter accusative singular form. And so we need to look at the rest of the sentence to figure out which case to doron is in. Next we've got toi despotei. We know that toi is masculine dative singular, and therefore this phrase, the master, is in the dative, and so it must either mean to the master or for the master. We'll see which sounds most appropriate once we've looked at the rest of the sentence. Next we've got didosin, which is the verb to give in the present indicative active third person singular, so he, she, it gives. And then at the end we've got ho doulos. The slave is in the nominative as indicated by the definite article, and so we know he must be doing the giving. So the slave gives, and now it wouldn't make any sense for to doron to be in the nominative. How would we fit that into the sentence when we already have a subject for the third person singular verb? It doesn't make any sense to take this as a nominative, but if we take it as an accusative phrase, then it makes a lot of sense, because this would mean the slave gives the gift or the present to the master. And so we shall translate this sentence as The slave gives the gift to the master. You could of course say the slave is giving the gift to the master. Once again, in this sentence, the dative was being used to indicate the indirect object, because the master is the person to whom something is being given. Okay, we have a fourth example here now, and that is Chodoulos perei ten epistolen toi despotei. We know the slave's in the nominative from the definite article, so the slave is once again doing the action, and this slave is doing a lot of work. He's a hard-working slave. So the slave's doing the action, and then we've got perei, which is perro, the verb to carry, but here it's in the third person singular of the present indicative active. So we have the slave carries, then we've got ten epistolan, the letter, in the accusative. We know it's in the accusative from the definite article. So the slave carries the letter, and then we've got toi despotei, which is the master in the dative case, which we know from the masculine dative singular definite article. So, is it to the master or for the master? Here, you might think, well, couldn't it be the slave carries the letter to the master? And now, the answer is yes, it could. But here I need to tell you that the dative case is rarely used to mean to in the sense of towards. The dative case is rarely used to express motion towards somewhere. It is occasionally used to mean to in the sense of towards, but usually Greek would use a preposition there. In particular, a preposition going with the accusative case to mean towards something or towards someone, or to someone, but in the sense of towards them. So, given what I've just told you, this is probably not the slave carries the letter to the master in the sense of towards him, but rather the slave carries the letter for the master. So I've put that translation there, the slave carries the letter for the master. And here, the dative is still being used to indicate the indirect object, because the master is the person for whom something is being done. Okay, here is a fifth example. This example is ton hippon luei chodoulos tei korei. To begin with, ton hippon is in the accusative, which we know from the masculine accusative singular definite article, and so the horse must be the direct object. He's having the verb done to him. And then we've got luei, which means he, she, it releases or is releasing. And then after that we've got chodoulos. We know the slave is the subject from the definite article, and so we know this means the slave releases, and we know the horse is the direct object, so it's the slave releases the horse, and then te korei is the girl in the dative. We know it's in the dative from the feminine dative singular definite article, and so this is either the slave releases the horse to the girl or for the girl. I would say that it's probably for the girl, given that the dative is rarely used to mean to in the sense of towards someone. And therefore we would translate the sentence as the slave releases the horse for the girl. And once again, the dative was being used here to express the indirect object. In this case, it's the person for whom something is being done. At least in the way that we've understood this sentence. But in principle, this could be to the girl or for the girl. Okay, our sixth and final example is chodidaskalos lege tois xenois. Here we actually have a phrase in the plural, and we also have somebody other than the slave doing an action. This time it's chodidaskalos, which we know means the teacher, and we know he's the one doing the action. In other words, he's the subject, because this is a nominative phrase, as indicated by the masculine nominative singular definite article. And then we've got the verb he, she, it speaks, so we know this means the teacher speaks or is speaking, and then we've got tois xenois. We know that xenos means foreigner or stranger. Here it's going with the masculine dative plural definite article, and so we know that this is the foreigners rather than just the foreigner, and we know that it must either mean to the foreigners or for the foreigners. Because we've got a verb of speaking here, it is in all probability to the foreigners or to the strangers. So this sentence would be translated as the teacher is speaking to the foreigners or the teacher is speaking to the strangers. Here, once again, the dative is being used to indicate the indirect object, the person to whom something is being said. But bear in mind, when you look at Greek outside of this lesson, the dative can be used to mean to or for in senses other than that of the indirect object. Okay, it's now time for you to do some practice using what you've learned about the dative case. Please translate these 5 sentences on the board using the definite article as a key. And please note that number 4 and number 5 are longer than just one line. Okay, they go on to the next line. So please pause the video and have a go at translating these. I'm now going to reveal the answers, so I hope that you've had a go. The first one, he korre to doron toi duloi didosin, should have been translated as the girl gives the gift to the slave. You could have said the girl is giving the gift to the slave, or the girl gives or is giving the present to the slave. We knew that the girl was in the nominative from the definite article, and then we had the verb gives here at the end. So the girl gives, todoron must have been therefore in the accusative rather than the nominative, which means that it's the direct object, it's the thing being given. So it was the girl gives the gift, and then you had the slave in the dative as indicated by the definite article. Okay, number 2 was hodoulos zdete tous hippus toi despotei. This should have been translated as the slave is looking for the horses for the master. We know that it means this because the slave's in the nominative. Then we had he, she, it is looking for or is seeking. You could have said the slave seeks the horses for the master, but I think looks for or is looking for sounds better. So we had the slave looks for the horses. We knew that they were plural and accusative from the definite article, which is masculine accusative plural. And then we had the master in the dative as indicated by the masculine dative singular definite article. And it only makes sense there to say for the master. You can't say the slave is looking for the horses to the master. You have to say for the master. But in both number 1 and number 2, the dative is indicating the indirect object. And in fact, throughout all of these, the dative is indicating the indirect object. Let's do number 3. Number 3 was tois didaskalois legusin hoiduloi. And this means the slaves are speaking to the teachers. We know that it means this because we have the slaves in the nominative here. We know it's nominative plural from the masculine nominative plural definite article. And then we have they speak or they are speaking, and we know who's doing the speaking, namely the slaves. So the slaves are speaking, and then we had the teachers in the dative as indicated by the masculine dative plural definite article. So we know it's the slaves are speaking to the teachers or for the teachers. It's much more probable that it's to the teachers. And so we said the slaves are speaking to the teachers, or the slaves speak to the teachers. Then number 4 was hai korai tois paidiois tadora didoasin. You should have translated this as the girls give the gifts to the little children. We had the girls in the nominative plural here, as indicated by the definite article. Then we had the verb to give right at the end, and it's they give, but we know who's doing the giving, it's the girls. So the girls give. Tadora, we know that this is accusative, it doesn't make any sense for it to be nominative. So the girls give the gifts to the little children. The little children were in the dative, as indicated by tois, the neuter dative plural definite article. It's neuter because it's going with paidiois, paidion being a neuter noun. Finally, for number 5, we had chodoulos didosi tais korais tas epistolas. And this should have been translated as the slave gives the letters to the girls. We know that it means this because we have the slave in the nominative, which we know from the definite article. Then we've got gives, so the slave gives. Tais korais is in the dative, so that's the to the girls part. But then after that, we've got the direct object in the accusative, tas epistolas. We know it's accusative plural from the feminine accusative plural definite article. And so it's the slave gives the letters to the girls. We knew this was to the girls since it's in the dative. We knew that this was in the dative because of the feminine dative plural definite article. Okay, so that's all 5 sentences done, and we are now out of time, unfortunately. But wait, there are 2 things that I neglected to mention earlier in the video, which I should mention now. The first of which is that the indirect object could be a thing rather than a person. It could be the thing, for example, for which something is done, because you don't always do something for a person. So for instance, if you said, he fought bravely for his country there would be the indirect object, even though it's not a person. Because it's the thing for which something has been done. An action has been done on behalf of the country, or for the country's benefit. However, earlier on in the video, I defined the indirect object in terms of people because it is typically people to whom something is given, said, etc., or for whom something is done. But just note that it can be a thing rather than a person. But please do remember that indicating the indirect object is just one of the ways in which the dative can be used to mean to or for. It can mean to or for in other ways as well. And the second thing that I wanted to note is that when the basic meaning of the dative is being employed, dative phrases are simply added to the sentence. When the dative is being used to mean to a noun or for a noun, the dative noun or phrase will typically just be added to the sentence. If not always, just be added to the sentence. But anyway, let me get back to concluding the video. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that you've enjoyed it and I hope that you found it useful. If you have found it useful, please like the video. And if there's anything you would like to say, please leave a comment. But for now, I shall see you again next time.